Okay, so this lecture is going to look at some developments over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries that come to be known by historians as the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. We have to be really careful about some of these terms. And more recently, scholars are much more open to sort of problematizing them because they recognize that something like the Enlightenment is a really sort of packed term. There's a lot of implications there about improvement, things getting better for people, people sort of achieving more progress. And obviously, all of that needs to be kind of carefully approached. This is a visual image from the period that sort of represents all of this. But as I'll talk about moving forward, the extent to which these individuals are advocating for change is to some degree limited, and not everyone was sort of on the same page about how much change was good change. So what are we talking about when we talk about the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason? So this is sort of an intellectual movement. So it is very much confined to ideas. So ideas being exchanged amongst a very sort of elite circle of individuals in Western Europe. And this overlaps with the scientific revolution. So to a large degree, they're building on not just some of the discoveries of the scientific revolution, but also just this continuing trend to separate sort of reason from faith and to sort of apply the scientific method to everything and to look for sort of empirical explanations. So critical thinking is sort of central to their investigation. They're not necessarily investigating sort of natural phenomena. They're sort of moving to sort of natural philosophies. They're moving to political philosophy. And they're even sort of thinking more generally about systems like anthropology. But they're still sort of applying the same methodology that we saw in the scientific revolution. Themes: liberty, progress, or in their opinion, sort of improving the state of things, toleration, specifically religious toleration. However, it's important to recognize that to a large degree that toleration is sort of limited, and I'll talk about that moving forward. Also, this sort of emphasis on individual liberties and shared humanities. A lot of these themes are themes that resonate right with the French Revolution, and so this provides a lot of the backdrop to many of those events. You also have some of these thinkers who focus a little bit more on sort of senses and sort of how senses and sensibility sort of intersect. So what you feel, emotions, and sort of calling for this elevation of the natural state of man and being very critical of what happens as a result of sort of civilization and the decadence that accompanies that. And then obviously this is going to have political, religious, and cultural implications. So it's going to inform revolutions. A lot of it is sort of informed by the English Civil War and the revolution that happens there, and then is a challenge to the absolutist monarchy in France, and then also sort of the colonial system that you have in the colonies in North America. And so that is something that sort of is related to this as well. And then cultural implications moving forward. So this is sort of a map of the state of things around 1700, so what Western Europe looks like. So to a large degree, the Enlightenment is the product of a number of sort of intersecting developments. One is Reformation. So in particular, these sort of religious changes that occur in the 16th century, one of the byproducts of that is an increase in literacy rates. So for example, in France, around this time, about half of all adult men had some literacy, so some rudimentary reading, and about a quarter of women. And these numbers are way, way up from the previous period. This also happens against the backdrop of the formation of the Atlantic system that we've talked about. So this connection between the Western Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and in particular sort of driven by the colonization that's happened in all of those places, and bringing these new territories into sort of the purview of Western Europe. And then there is just generally this increase in prosperity during this period, particularly that middle class is starting to have more disposable income and a little bit more disposable time. And so they're interacting more with some of this public discourse. So the leading voices, I'm not going to cover everybody. This isn't comprehensive, but I'm going to try and give you a sense of sort of the variety of individuals as well as the variety of their voices that sort of contribute to this dialogue. So one group that sort of initiates a lot of the conversation are these individuals known as philosophes. So they're primarily associated with France. And one of the things that we'll see across all of these examples of different individuals is many of them are asking similar questions, but a lot of them have very different answers. And so it's important to note moments of consensus as well as moments where they differ. A lot of this is happening then across Western Europe, virtually, I guess, through an exchange of letters. So, for example, we know that Voltaire, over the course of his lifetime, personally produced over 18,000 letters. So these individuals are entering into this sort of conversation, distanced conversation with other individuals who share these common interests. And France in particular, because at the time, France was kind of the shared language of Europe. So most elites in Europe spoke their own vernacular and French. And a lot of the times then we'll see, especially in the continent, not as much in England, you still have censorship very much in place. So they'll employ methods like satire, or they'll employ different sort of alternative literary genres like plays or novels to present what's very much a critique of the current system. But this is the way they can kind of elude censorship and shutting down their publications. It is also important to note that while they in many respects are calling for reform or change, none of these individuals is super radical. So they're still staying within the confines of a very recognizable system. They just want to adjust that system a bit. This is a portrait of a number of individuals who are called, so it's called philosophes. So sort of gathering. And so I think it gives you kind of a visual of who the individuals were that are participating in this dialogue. So one of the leading philosophes is Voltaire. So this is sort of his pen name. Voltaire is from France. He, you can see, dies kind of right before the eve of the revolution, but a lot of his ideas are really influential in sort of political philosophy that provides the foundation for the change and then eventually that shift towards more democratic systems of representation. His early writings, he runs into a lot of trouble. He's actually a judge by training, but then he begins to become more prolific, in particular critiquing the political system. So the absolutist monarchy in France. He's also very critical of the Catholic Church as an institution. And so he's arrested on a number of occasions. He's imprisoned temporarily. Eventually, he goes to England because that provides him a little bit more liberty to kind of disseminate his ideas. While he is very critical of things like absolutism, and he does call for change, particularly sort of in terms of allowing people more freedoms and rejecting religious tolerance and more uniformity in laws. He also does sort of advocate this biological explanation for sort of the different races. He sees a distinction, a very scientific distinction between, say, the whites of Western Europe and the people of India and the people of Africa and the indigenous populations in the Americas. And in many instances, he is the way he describes these people, he very much sees the white Europeans as the superior of all of these different groups. So it is important to recognize that while a lot of these individuals are advocating for sort of liberty and equality, it has very clear limits. Someone who takes sort of a different tack and actually is really critical of colonial treatment of a lot of the local populations, especially in the Middle East and India, is Montesquieu. And so Montesquieu produces his Persian letters in 1721, and this is sort of a spin on what's become sort of this common trope of travel literature. So it is not uncommon for sort of wealthy Europeans to sort of travel in some of these newly colonized places. They're mostly driven by sort of a curiosity, but a lot of the times the way they describe the local inhabitants is it's very sort of paternalistic. It sort of reduces them to sort of this secondary state. It describes practices and appearances as like oddities at best, but is clearly very sort of critical at worst. And seen in some instances these people as almost subhuman. Like, can you believe they do this? So using terms like savages. He flips the script in his Persian letters, and what he has two people from Persia visiting France and describing the French people and French customs sort of in that same sort of tone. So almost very sort of confused. Can you believe they do this? This seems so strange. And in some instances, really sort of focusing on some of those practices in France, particularly sort of punitive practices, capital punishment, treatment of criminals, treatment of the poor, and the despotic nature of sort of the French monarchy, really showing that for what it is from the perspective of these outsiders. And so Montesquieu is very much a critique of sort of a lot of French practice and culture, and sort of shows a different sort of view about differences between the races than someone like Voltaire. Sort of another voice in this is Rousseau. So in 1762, he produces his really sort of important work here, The Social Contract. And this becomes really significant moving forward, particularly in the American Revolution, but also the French Revolution. So Rousseau is actually Swiss. He is from very modest origins. His father is a watchmaker, but his intellectual abilities really sort of bring him into the forefront of a lot of these conversations. And it's Rousseau who really introduces this idea that a government is there because it represents the will of the people. And if it's not representing the will of the people, then it no longer has the right to make decisions for those people, and it can be replaced. So this is the essence of the social contract, right? And so these are ideas very much invoked by American revolutionaries. So the king in England isn't representing their will, therefore he can be replaced. Rousseau very much emphasizes the significance of individual freedom, and he talks about how this is sort of essential. We have to recognize individual freedoms to sort of recognize what sort of connects us all, this sort of common humanity. He also advocates these ideas that all men, and he doesn't qualify that, possess sort of natural innate rights, and then this demands sort of equality of treatment. So Rousseau in part sees civilization as this sort of destructive force because it takes us away from our more natural state where we're sort of purist, and it ends up sort of corrupting. He also very much sort of admires indigenous populations, in particular sort of some of the indigenous populations in the Americas he sees as representing or embodying sort of natural state of being. They haven't been corrupted by civilization yet. This is not without its problems, but it does sort of lend Rousseau to be very, very critical of colonialism and very critical of the treatment of indigenous peoples in a variety of places. Adam Smith is in Scotland. Most people sort of associate Adam Smith with his economic theories, which are obviously extraordinarily important. So it's Adam Smith who is often sort of described as the father of modern economics. In particular, his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, or the wealth of nations, you can see the 3-volume publication pictured here, is incredibly influential. But even before that, he produced his theory of moral sentiment. And in this, he really sort of emphasizes sort of shared common humanity amongst all individuals. Adam Smith sort of advances this notion that social interaction just naturally fosters sort of mutual respect and sympathy, and that ultimately it overcomes our tendencies towards self-interest. So he kind of has this belief in sort of the innate good in people. And he also really does argue for the importance of sort of acknowledging our senses and sort of our sensual interactions with the natural world, and how we shouldn't sort of lose sight of the importance of our sort of natural instincts and impulses, which sometimes we too often sort of let our sensibilities or our good judgments sort of overcome those instincts. And Smith, much like Rousseau, does sort of push back a little bit against the treatment of some of these native peoples in the various colonies, though the extent to which he would undermine sort of the colonial system is questionable, given sort of the economic theories that he does advocate. So Immanuel Kant is from Germany. Many of you probably have heard of Kant because of his association with philosophy, in particular transcendental philosophy, which is still extraordinarily influential. Kant is from Germany, and it's really from this particular treatise written by Kant, What is Enlightenment, in 1784, which is pictured here. This is where that term enlightenment kind of comes from. And Kant is really sort of thinking back to Greek and Roman traditions and sort of applications of reason, but also sort of reason as a source of morality, and how we need to sort of move away from more polarizing emotional impulses, sort of particularly associated perhaps with sort of religion. He does state sort of autonomous thinking as sort of imperative, that individuals need to think for themselves and shouldn't be controlled by external forces. And so in that respect, Kant's sort of embrace of philosophy is really sort of foundational to Enlightenment theories moving forward. He's also very influential on the emergence of sort of biological explanations for differences between the races, which the way they evolve end up arguing for not just differences, but hierarchies and superiority of the race associated with Western Europe. In 1775, he publishes a treatise on the different races of man. And he argues that based on sort of Greek theories of the humors, there are 4 different races, all ultimately originate from a single race. Differences in terms of appearance, in terms of sort of the structures of their societies, in terms of their cultures, are due to climatic conditions. But he doesn't just argue for difference, he also argues for a hierarchy. And so to Kant, the sort of closest descendant to that original race and the most superior intellectually and morally and physically is the Western Europeans. And he sees in particular Northern Germany as the origin of all mankind. And so not only does he provide this sort of biological basis for the difference between the races, sort of drawing on these attempts to impose empirical categories of difference, but because he is injecting this idea of the superiority of the Western European, the white race, he does contribute to that foundation for these biologically racist, the systematic racism that enters European society, and for many individuals, legitimate practices like not just colonialism, but a really oppressive colonialism. This is a portrait of Kant and some of his friends sort of having dinner and conversation in Germany. So to what extent did these ideas get disseminated beyond sort of this small circle of individuals? Very difficult to know. We do know that as people start to have more leisure time and engage in more public activities like gathering together at a coffee house, they are engaged in just sort of discussing some of these issues. That said, you can see from these sort of representations who these people were. They tended to be the very sort of upper middle class or the upper classes of society. So individuals with the time and the disposable income to engage in this type of activity because they didn't need to be working or producing things with their hands. They obviously weren't laborers. Probably more commonly, middle class individuals would have come into contact with these ideas in the form of newspapers or pamphlets. We do start to see the first sort of daily newspapers being produced in London, and then after the French Revolution, we see them in France as well. These would have provided sort of easy access to ideas on a regular basis. They would have been fairly cheap. And even someone with sort of moderate literacy would have had access to them. So this is probably, if these ideas did get any sort of traction amongst the public, this would probably be how they would encounter them. In terms of who is engaged in this conversation, for the most part, we know that most of the spaces and the places where it occurred were prohibited to women. So women couldn't attend a coffee house unless they were working there. Women couldn't be members of these scientific academies, these national academies. They could not attend or teach at university, which a lot of these sort of leading figures did. And so to a large degree, women were sort of marginalized from participation in this sort of movement. The one exception would be what's pictured here, sort of private salons. And so this is Madame du Châtelet, who actually was sort of a patron of Voltaire. He stayed with her for a lot of the time that he was in exile. And so what would happen is these women would sort of open up their homes and host these gatherings and invite these men to just kind of come and to eat and to drink and to mingle and to have conversation. And so because these were private spaces within their homes, women could participate. And so you can see in this painting a number of female figures who were present. Personal letters were another instance where women could be part of the conversation. So a lot of those 18,000 letters written by Voltaire were actually sent to Madame du Châtelet. So on a private level, women were part of the conversation, but they were never sort of part of the public version. So it's always difficult to measure the impact of these intellectual developments on sort of day-to-day life. We do know, and this is very much reflected in the French Revolution, that there is more and more sort of popular interest in politics. And a lot of this is due to the critique that's being presented by some of these individuals, and then their attempt to disseminate that critique to a wider sort of audience. We do know that there's also at this time sort of a shift, a pushback. People are still very religious, but what they are objecting to is religion kind of controlling the state. So the idea of politics and religion being sort of unified. So this is one of the critiques of the Civil War in England, as well as the critique of the French monarchy, right? So they want that separation. They want religion to be sort of a private matter and to not have sort of a public role. Also connecting economic and political interests. This is something we definitely see in Adam Smith, who sort of thinks about economies and the foundation of an economy and how a governing system can sort of work to improve economic conditions, or in the case of sort of mercantilism, which is present before this, can really work to its detriment. And this is right on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. So we'll see instances when the state is open to certain advances, economic prosperity, places where the state is more controlling, they do not have that participation in some of the changes associated with the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, it informs the French and the American Revolution, particularly in terms of the political discourse, but also in terms of the moral philosophy. This sort of focus on liberty and equality and common humanity shared by everyone is something that gains a lot of traction. And then there is this question of how far are they extending those calls for liberty and equality and common humanity. For many of these individuals, it was very much reserved to Western Europeans. For many of them, it was very much reserved. Like for Kant, Kant was very critical about women. He did not believe that they had the intellectual capacity of men. So many of these individuals didn't believe that they should be extended even beyond just white European men. Some were more open to engaging women, but did not extend this to anyone beyond Western Europe's borders. So indigenous populations in the Americans or the Africans or people that they're encountering in India or Asia. And then some people were actually very critical of these colonial systems that are developing and becoming increasingly oppressive. So there's a diversity of opinion, and then there's going to be a diversity of sort of impact depending on which of those opinions is sort of integrated into different countries and different systems.